server-side rendering can be a really big pain in the butt. And if you're dealing with Node, obviously it's a lot easier. You just kind of run the JavaScript on the server, you spit it out to the front end, you have no problems. But when you deal with something like Java or C#, where the backend is what's responsible for writing the template to the user, you end up needing to use some weird server-side language. Anyone here use JSP? Does anyone know what that is? Does anyone hate it as much as I do? Yeah, well, I mean, maybe you don't, but I think putting XML in your XML is terrible. But it still requires you ultimately to have the server send you that data. This is where you end up getting a lot of like doing imperative DOM mutations. You have to manually update it because you don't have that stuff kind of saved in your JavaScript for you. And you kind of end up like losing the purpose of building these kind of big service or big single page apps, because the server has to render that stuff and you have to bootstrap off of it anyway. So why bring in React when you really kind of end up having to use JSP for 90% of this stuff anyway? But Vue actually has a really big advantage here, so it's really kind of good for this whole process. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about why we use Vue.js on this particular project, talk a bit about slots themselves and how they make it really beneficial for using Vue in these sort of server-side environments. And then I'm going to talk about one of the specific problems that we ran into when dealing with some of these server-side rendering and how we used Vuex specifically to solve them. So for starters, we'll look at why we'll do Vue.js. Obviously, it's a very solid framework. It has a very solid backing in the community. It's about half the size of React, about 20 kilobytes to 43 last time I checked, and often can be more performant because it can focus specifically on doing specific DOM updates based on property changes rather than needing to do the whole kind of render diff cycle. It's easy to understand. It's very easy to work with HTML-based templating language, strong international adoption, obviously backed by a lot of major Chinese firms. And all these are really good reasons, but both of those are kind of like, well, we could use one or the other. But if you're dealing with specifically these sort of back-end rendered environments, what you can do, the major advantage that Vue has that React does not have, and really is not possible for it to emulate, is this idea that the backend can render the templates and Vue can bootstrap off of those templates rather than needing to have all of that stuff be client-side rendered. So when you bootstrap the app, you can grab that initial div and you can say, I'm going to use this as the template for my root component. I'm sorry if that's kind of bugging people, but you can then kind of scale the specificity of your components from, if you have some kind of like plain content components, you don't need to put all that stuff into Vue. You can just have the backend render that. Like if you just got like a plain, like a header image and some text, the backend can just render the header image and the text. And you get a lot of benefits out of being able to turn things that are more interactive into being more complex using Vue when you need it, and let the server be responsible for things where the content is a bit more static. And so you get a lot of the SEO benefits then of having the server-side rendering, which is something that often you're going to throw Node into your stack in order to solve, because you need to get that HTML to Google or whatever so that they can index your content. And if you render it with Vue, you can render all of the SEO important stuff like your H1 tags and the content and the descriptions and whatnot, and use slots to pass that stuff into your JavaScript and work that correctly. Let's see, is this getting a little bigger? Yeah, there we go. Okay, we'll zoom in a little bit. But this is just an example. I did kind of a basic kind of concept here talking about, like, let's say we have a building a basic blog, you've got a list of blog posts, and you've got a couple of blog posts that you've got the blog post list, and then you've got a couple of blog posts that you're passing in there. And you see on this page, we've got the H1 at the top. That's completely static. That's not tied to any particular input. So that can just be rendered by the back end and have Google crawl it the way you expect it. And then you have these individual blog post components that kind of look a little bit web component-like, where you have kind of these custom components. And the server can just spit that out directly into the markup that the user is getting, and Vue can bootstrap off of it and use it to start up its engine. So we can start off by bootstrapping off of this template and use the DOM itself as the template, which means that the backend is then responsible for defining the entire page structure. So if you're dealing with something like we did, where you had a CMS where the user can input, I want these 3 components on this page in this order, and then I need to put the text in, especially however you need that, you don't have to, like you're able to kind of thread the difference between who's responsible for what without having to either have the backend have complete control over it or the front end complete control of it. You can kind of share this space a little bit with the backend in a way that can be more difficult than something like React. So Vue doesn't have to take over the whole page, and you can again, I said you can decorate components that need the interactivity and decorate these pieces that maybe need some more complexity around them. And otherwise, if you don't need it, you can just let it spit out as static content, and then the user can use it and work with that. So obviously, there's some concepts in there that may not make sense kind of on first blush, so we're going to dive a bit into the concept of the slot, which actually was ported originally from web components, and that Vue kind of picked that up and started using it here. But you see in this little component, the blog post, we've got a URL as a property that's being passed in. We've got the H2 slot with the name title, and the image slot with an image, and a P slot with a summary that all gets passed into this Vue component. And then when we actually look at the Vue component, we can see that these slots, you have this slot element, and this would be in your .vue file. You'd have this template, and you have this slot with the name, and so if we go back a slide and we see we have H2 slot title, that's going to get placed when Vue takes over. When Vue takes over and starts to render the component, it's going to take that content, take the content from the, wow. Can I switch to something else? This is starting to get on my nerves. It's going to take the content from the back end and pass that into, yeah, thank you so much. I don't know which one was causing the problems, but let's go like this, and I'm going to stand here like a musician. Yeah, so it takes the content from the back end rendered component and passes it into the slot on the Vue side component. And then when Vue takes over, it renders the content into that page so that you can kind of split up. You do get this kind of split between, now the front end takes over, and now it's responsible for structuring that in a way that then appears pleasing to the user. You style this content in this way, and you have all that stuff set up. But then what you've done now is you've kind of defined what specifically the backend is responsible for giving you. The backend is responsible for giving you an H2 tag with the title of the blog post. It's responsible for giving you an image with its summary. And the front end is then responsible for structuring that content and applying styles. So it provides a nice kind of division of responsibilities between the back end and the front end, where you can say, well, so I know if I'm a CMS author, I need to provide for this component an H2, I need to provide text for this H2 element. And it makes it easy to know who's responsible for what. Is this coming from the back end? Is this coming from the front end? Who's responsible for styling this and changing this problems? And so you get the benefit of the slots, because the biggest thing that I found actually is that because the image tag is rendered by the back end, what the browser does, so if you're familiar with kind of how the browser renders an HTML page, it starts at the top and starts rendering it as it goes down. So if it comes across a CSS tag, it'll grab that CSS and it'll start applying those styles to the page. And then it'll go down and go through the HTML, and it will see like an image tag, and we'll make the request for that image tag. And it starts from the top and reads all the way through the page. And so what happens is, because you're not rendering something like the image tag by the front end, the browser is actually able to start the request for the image earlier than it would be if it had to wait for the JavaScript to download, parse, and execute, and then inject the image tag into the page. It can start the request for the image earlier. So what happens is you actually get better performance from a user perspective, because the images that may get moved around and put into the location that they're expected to once the JavaScript bootstraps has already been downloaded. So you don't have to worry about this problem of like, well, the user doesn't see anything until the JavaScript has been downloaded and executed. We got some of these content pieces that can be downloaded and put into place before the JavaScript has gotten there. And so you can actually apply, if we go back a little bit to this example, you can actually apply styles to the blog post element as if it was a regular HTML element. So now what you can actually do is you can style the page, maybe not exactly how it's going to turn out once the JavaScript turns on, but close enough such that when the JavaScript executes and starts to apply its structure and the styles to the page, it's close enough to the way it's going to end up that it's not so jarring to the user that like suddenly things start moving around and jumping around. But you can apply styles to this, so you have, well, I'm going to center this text under the blog post element the same way that I would center the text within the structure, so that the text doesn't really move so much when the JavaScript executes. And so you get this kind of performance perception benefit, because the page is not like shifting dramatically as the page is loading. And obviously the other main benefit is that you get this improved SEO benefit, because the H1 and H2 tags are now available on the page so that Google can parse and whatever and do its SEO fun. The main problem that we ran into when kind of taking advantage of this technique is that you lose the connection between the child and the parent, the way that you kind of normally expect like a component, when you nest components, that a child can emit events to a parent. And you end up with this kind of this bit of indirection. So if we look back at the example that I had here, or actually that's going too far back. If I look at an example at the blog list where I have the 2 blog posts inside of it, you can't really tell looking at the blog post component itself that the blog post component belongs as part of the blog list, and that the blog list itself kind of requires this in particular. And so it can be a little difficult you do have kind of this coupling that may not necessarily be clear, but the bigger problem that you run into is that you lose the parent-child communication, because the parent can't, or the child can't emit events to the parent, because when you pass something in via slot, it's not in the context of the parent that it's being passed into. It's in the context of the component above both of those. So in that original example where you had the blog list and you had the 2 blog posts, it's actually in the context of the root component. And so you can't actually emit events from blog post and get it into the blog post list. So this is where we brought in VueNYC in order to kind of solve this problem. What VueNYC is, for those who may not necessarily be familiar with it, is it's a Redux-like centralized store for VueNYC that's built around the principles that VueNYC, the principles that Vue kind of brings to the table in terms of being kind of mutation-based and using its reactivity system. And it allowed it for us to solve a lot of these problems with parent-child communication, because instead of emitting events up into the parent the way that you kind of normally would do when you kind of build the component hierarchy, you communicate through the VueNYC store. And so what this means is, we'll take this as another example, where this might be a better example, because in this case we have a tab container. It's got 2 tabs, and a tab contents for each of those 2 tabs. And those tabs, the idea is that when you click on a tab, then the content for that tab shows and the content for the other tabs hide. And maybe you change an active state on which tab has been clicked, and those 2 things or multiple things switch as you click between those tabs. And normally what you might do is you would say, well, I've got these tabs underneath here, they'd emit event to the parent, which would be responsible for passing in the data into these child components that would say either show your active state or show your hidden state, whatever you'd want to do. But because we've got this kind of indirection context problem, this tab container can't emit its click event directly to the parent. It's got to emit it to either the root component or whatever else is directly above it. It can't emit it into the tab container. And so what we do instead is we take the tab container, and I've kind of dubbed this the registering module pattern. The idea is that you take the container component that you want to emit data into, and you register a VueNYC module in that component's mounted lifecycle event. So you add the VueNYC module into the store, and then we use that to do all our communication. So if we have this as an example, this is the tab header itself. We're using, in this case, the VueNYC store's getters to check if the tab is visible, and we're using the commit action, or the commit to dispatch a mutation into the VueNYC store. And the idea is that each of the individual components is instead passed the information that it needs, the context that it needs, in order to get the information out of the VueNYC store that it needs for its specific instance. So we can tell, in this case, whether or not it's visible based on whether the ID it has for itself matches the ID of what is supposed to be currently shown. And so all the logic between that handles the communication between the tab container and the individual tab headers and tab content lives in the module that would get registered at the point at which it's mounted. And so we have like a visible tab here, starts off at 0. We have a getter that we can pass in an ID and check whether the current visible tab is, and then we've got that mutation, the header click, that would set the current visible tab to the header that was clicked. And so what this does is obviously some of this stuff is beneficial regardless of whether you're dealing with a particular problem. Keeping all your logic in a single centralized place that is easy to test in this way, and decoupling it from the components, is a benefit regardless of whether you need to solve this kind of communication problem. But it allows you to then wire up each of these individual components into the store without having to worry about, well, I can't figure out how to get this piece to talk to this piece without kind of looping it through some other piece that kind of exists over elsewhere. Like if you have this root component that is responsible for kind of managing the flow of events through your application, it can get like a lot of logic that lives in a place that doesn't really need to have it. And so you can instead of doing it this way, each component that needs to be able to talk in that way can be responsible for registering the module. And now you have like a folder structure where you got, well, I got this tab component, and I got the tab list, and I've got the module, and I've got the tab component. All that stuff kind of lives next to each other, and it's really easy to tell how all of these things interact. And so it can provide the context that's needed and getters to pull that context out of the store. So just to, I know I kind of went through a lot, and I'm sure there are people in this room who are dealing with Java C# type backends, and so I really found that Vue was extremely useful and extremely pleasant to work with in this type of environment. So obviously Vue.js provides kind of this harmony between server side and backend, and kind of the interactivity allows you to scale up the interactivity based on the needs of the component, gives you some SEO benefits as well, and if you run a communication through Vuex, you end up with kind of a really nice system for dealing with these sorts of environments, which can otherwise be really tough because you're often then falling back onto traditional DOM mutations and jQuery type shit. No one wants to deal with that anymore. So thank you for your time. Does anyone have any questions? The question is testing related to this. This guy is all about testing. Yeah, so you can, I mean, as I said, for all the logic related to the Vuex stuff, that's easily testable, because those are, you pass in, like, this is the current state, this is maybe your payload, and you check that the result is the object that you're expecting, the shape that you're expecting to. I mean, we use Jest for our testing in particular, but I mean, it's essentially at that point you're just testing functions, right? So you're passing in an object, you're passing in some information, you're checking that the resulting object looks the way that you expect it to. So there isn't really a lot of like you don't have to mock extra things. I mean, unless you're doing API requests, and then that's kind of like outside of the scope of this particular problem. But all of this for the Vuex related thing in particular is just testing functions and making sure that the results are what you expect them to be. We did have to write unit tests for this particular project. That's a long story, but I found writing unit tests for components themselves to actually be a complete waste of time. Especially for Vue in particular, because you end up kind of muddling a lot of the logic along with the component, and I didn't really find that was helpful.
This is exactly our problem here. So we have JSPs, we do all sorts of bootstrapping onto them. It almost sounds to me though like you've pushed the problem onto the backend devs. Like now the templates need to know all this stuff about these components. Is that because you guys own the templates on the front end and you guys are going in and modifying that? That's
actually a very interesting question. He's actually asking about who's responsible for the JSP templates themselves, or in this case we were dealing with C#, so they were Razor templates. We actually had kind of a nice solution for that. What we did is we used a tool called Fractal, which allows you to build out, it's like a component library tool, and allows you to build out the templates and handlebars. And so what we did is we took the templates, we built the components that we needed, and we developed them in this kind of Fractal environment with handlebars templates. And then that we'd have like a separate JSON file that would be responsible for passing the content and context into the handlebars templates. And then what we would do is we'd have the handlebars templates themselves then become like the source of truth for what the template should look like. And then we go to the backend developer and you're like, so this is what our HTML should look like, stick this in a JSP type of a thing. And then they would be responsible for saying, okay, so you need this title here, this has got to come from the backend here, this has got to come here. But they don't actually have to deal with the HTML itself. They can copy it out of a handlebars template and paste it in. And the handlebars syntax is not complicated that they can't wrap their head around that. So it's really easy for them to look and say, okay, so if this statement is true, then we need to output this, and they can put all that logic, they can translate it from handlebars into JSP or Razor or whatever, and that part becomes really easy. But the solution for us then was essentially to have something separate from JSP and C# that is the source of truth for what the templates should look like when they're rendered by the backend. And the front end is responsible for owning those, and also then responsible for, like, if we have a template that doesn't render the way it's supposed to, looking at the differences and figuring out what's the problem.
This might be outside the remit of your talk, but I'm curious, kind of looking at where Vue is going as a library, it looks like slots and scope slots now are taking more of a prominence in the way we build components and applications. Did you get a chance to play with scope slots in this context? And kind of
scope slots make no sense to me, I'm sorry. He's asking about scope slots. I looked into them actually as a solution for another problem I came across, but it was like like you pass data down to the child who's responsible for passing it to the parent. It didn't make sense to me. And I hadn't really come across a solution, at least the loose grasp of what I could figure out for what scoped slots were. It wasn't a solution to a problem that I actually had. So I haven't used them. I can't really speak to them. Did you have a question in the back related to testing? Yeah.
What does a WebDriver test look like in respect to isolated components?
We didn't write WebDriver tests for this. It was unit tests and Jest for the most part. We had, I guess, a third-party QA engineer who wrote some automated tests, but I wasn't involved in that process.
So if you're in a microservices type architecture for the front end, the solution of parent to child may get a little complicated. Do you have any ideas for that?
I mean, if you're building so you're asking about microservices type architecture. I mean, I have to imagine if you're running a bunch of microservices, you can probably run a node server, in which case this whole problem kind of goes away because you can just render it on the back end, yeah. So I don't think this really, maybe this becomes more complicated because if you have, like at that point, maybe you're building like a single page app. Like if you've gotten to the point where you're building a microservices level architecture, you're not building like a CMS on a content site. That's kind of a different class of problems that you're dealing with. In which case, you can probably just do server-side rendering and get it the way that you want it to look the way that you, yeah. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding?
So I think that's true to a certain extent, but in certain cases your architecture is built where you've got like a Java backend for one piece of the application, and you've got a C# or C++ backend for another piece. Like the backend becomes agnostic and it's serving you content from multiple places. So like you can't be guaranteed that, right?
Good luck. I mean, if you have that many different languages in your backend stack, good luck hiring for that. I mean, it sounds to me like if I'm in your shoes that I would set up a node server and make that entirely responsible for the front end. Like at that point, if you have like a Java backend and a C++ backend and maybe like some Go microservices and like whatever, like you've got the DevOps people who know how to set stuff up. Like you've got the infrastructure around you where you can run a node server in production and then you really actually take back to the front end the responsibility for doing all of your rendering. So you don't really need to I wouldn't bother setting up Java backends to render if you have microservices. I mean, maybe there are use cases for it, in which case I don't really have any advice for you, but that's kind of probably what I would advocate for in that case. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.